Anger and jealousy would lead to a brutal homicide. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Annette Burnside. Viewer discretion is advised. Annette Marie Schoppinger, she was born on July 22nd, 1963, and she was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. When Annette was 16, the family would end up moving to Florida, specifically to the Manatee County area. Annette was always described as kind of like a very shy, almost bashful person. Socializing wasn't the easiest thing for her to do. And so when the family moved to Florida, she was still in high school, and she just had issues, interacting and with fellow classmates and making a group of friends there. It wasn't easy for her. And from what it sounds like, when she was 16 or 17 years old, she ends up dropping out of high school and gets a job as a cashier at a local grocery store. After working there for a short amount of time, she ends up befriending, I guess, a man who worked behind the deli counter. His name was Jim Burnside. Jim was 28 years older than Annette. And one day, Jim approached her and asked her out on a date. And she said yes. Her parents were not happy about this. They did not like Jim. They would obviously have hoped that she would have found someone in her age bracket, but she apparently fell in love with Jim pretty quickly. Annette's mom, after meeting Jim, she said that she just always felt so uncomfortable around him. Her mom and dad both were like, we just get bad vibes from this guy. I mean, first of all, he's 28 years older. It's just, there was just a lot of things, there were a lot of red flags they noticed with him, but they were at times kind of afraid to say anything to Annette because they didn't want to, anger her. Obviously, this is different times. This was in the very early 80s when all of this started. By 1981, Annette is 18 years old and Jim proposes to her and they get married. Jim was 46 years old when he married 18-year-old Annette. And from the moment they got married, Annette's life was a living hell. The domestic abuse started pretty much from day one. It was extreme verbal abuse, but it was also physical abuse. The violence in the home just began to escalate and escalate and escalate. She didn't tell anyone because, well, she was afraid of Jim. What would he do to me if I told anyone? So she had to play off, like unfortunately, so many women have to do in these situations, that everything is fine, everything is hunky-dory, there's nothing wrong here, just to appease him and for him to not get more violent towards her, or worse, kill her. So she became trapped. Like, again, unfortunately, a lot of women have become trapped in this exact same scenario. They fear for their lives, and that's why they don't leave. Jim was insanely jealous of her. She was not allowed to do anything or go anywhere, especially without his approval first. Then he would drink a lot. He was an alcoholic, and when he got drunk, he would beat her. And he one time told her, if you ever try to leave me, I will kill you. Right around the time their first anniversary was coming up, Annette would end up going to a battered women's shelter, and she basically checked herself into it. She called Jim from the shelter and said, this is it, I'm done, I'm leaving you. And he says on the phone to her, if you do that, I will find you and I will kill you, but also I will kill your family. And so she felt afraid for her family. And so she goes back. She didn't want her family to suffer because of her. And that alone is that's just beyond tragic and horrible. And then for the next couple of years, they remain a couple. And he continues to be abusive towards her. But they also end up having two children, two daughters. Their daughters' names were Stacy and Tara. And there was a small chunk of time after the kids were born that things seemed to be changing. Things seemed to be turning more positive. Jim wasn't, as abusive to her. Annette got to a point where she wanted to have a job because Jim wouldn't allow her to have a job since they got married. But he had lost his job, and so he actually allowed her to go get work as a receptionist at a car dealership, which kind of surprised a lot of people because of how jealous he was, of how he didn't like her being around any men whatsoever. That was surprising to many people. Once she got a job there, though, she was happy. She was so excited, and she excelled very quickly there. She was doing great. But Jim still controlled her because he was the one to have to drop her off to work, and pick her up from work. She wasn't allowed to do that on her own. She became friends with a co-worker who only has identified himself as Dave. I'm not sure if that's actually his real name or not, but he was a car dealer there, and she asked him advice about purchasing her own car. Essentially, she ended up getting her own car. Within a few days of her getting it, Jim destroyed it. Jim would go out, he went outside with several tools, and he began bashing in the headlights. He broke the taillights. He was ripping things out of the engine. He just annihilated that car. And he goes running back into the house because he was pissed that she bought a car, meaning she would have her own freedom to go whenever she wants, wherever she pleases. And he didn't like that. And at the time, one of their daughters was 5 years old. And Annette and the daughter were in the living room playing when all this happened. He comes storming back into the house and he threatens to kill Annette. And she's obviously terrified. And his little daughter, his 5-year-old daughter, looks at him and says, "Daddy, you wouldn't kill me, would you?" He looks her right in the face and says, "Yes, I would. I would absolutely kill you." And so that was the final straw. The following day, she gets in touch with police while Jim was out of the house. And she asks police to escort her around the house to get her belongings and her kids' belongings and take her to, I guess, the airport because of the domestic abuse. And they were very willing to help her. So she gets in, cops drop her off at the airport. She flies the kids while Jim is still out. She literally flies the kids to a different state to be with family. And then within 5 days, she has to fly back to Florida because she has to continue working at her job. And for a little while, Jim thought she had just picked her up and left him and didn't know where she was. But then he found out she was back in town and back at the car dealership. And so according to numerous witnesses, Jim was stalking her at the car dealership. He would sit outside with binoculars and watching her as she interacted with everyone. And they tried to go to the police and say, "Listen, he's stalking, me. He's stalking Annette." Police couldn't do anything because basically, essentially what they said is that he needed to actually do something in order for them to do something. Basically meaning she has to be physically harmed or worse before we can step in, which is insane. On February 17th, 1988, all of this would come to an end. Annette was 3 days away from having to attend a court hearing for the divorce proceedings. Jim had stalked her at the car dealership. He saw her go and meet this Dave coworker of hers for lunch, and she gets into the car with Dave, and all of a sudden, a van pulls up behind them, and it's Jim. Jim gets out armed with a rifle, and he breaks the window on the passenger seat where Annette is sitting. Dave gets out of the car and starts to confront Jim, basically trying to defend Annette. Jim lifts the rifle, points it directly at Dave, and shoots him. He was shot in his abdomen. Annette gets out of the car. She begins to scream. She tries to run. She gets, 50, 60 feet away before Jim catches up to her, knocks her to the ground, takes a knife, and stabs her numerous times until she is dead. And then Jim runs. He takes off. Witnesses who observed this basically tried to get there as fast as they could to help, but it was already too late. The coroner would determine that Annette suffered 15 stab wounds. The majority of them were inflicted upon her after she was already deceased. Dave, by some miracle, was still conscious. He was still actually alive. He was rushed to the hospital, and they managed to save him, and he recovered. And so he was able to give a very detailed statement to police about what happened and who did this. All of this happened in broad daylight, right in front of people. And Jim escaped in broad daylight in front of people. And from that point moving forward, Jim Burnside was a wanted fugitive. He was going to be charged with the murder of his wife, Annette. About 3 years later or so, at Annette's gravesite, a groundskeeper who was doing some work nearby noticed a man in a baseball cap, kind of almost appeared like he was trying to hide himself, was at Annette's grave. And then the groundskeeper approached him, and the man at the grave ran away. And the groundskeeper would later identify that man as Jim Burnside, based on a photo lineup. On October 23rd, 1991, this case actually airs on Unsolved Mysteries, and then later it appears on America's Most Wanted. After one of the airings on Unsolved Mysteries, a couple in Shelby County, Alabama, calls the authorities to report that they think they know where Jim Burnside is. They know him as a man named Al Wilson. He was working as a carpenter there. in that area. And I guess he was working at a flea market. And so the FBI contacts the local police there and says, we think he's going to be there at this flea market. We need you to go there and apprehend him. It was October 24th, 1991. The FBI does get to the flea market and they do spot Jim Burnside. And what happens is basically Jim runs and he pulls out a .357 Magnum and begins firing at the police. The police fire back. He gets into a truck and he's still firing his weapon from the truck. Police are firing back at him. And eventually he stops shooting because he has been shot twice. But they were not fatal wounds. They were superficial wounds for the most part. And so they were able to apprehend him. They put him in cuffs and they arrested him. According to people in his life at that time, he came off very concerned, very nervous, literally within days of the Unsolved Mysteries episode airing. It is believed by numerous people that he actually saw himself on America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries and knew that the jig was up, that someone was going to identify him and there was nowhere else he could go. In February of 1992, he went to trial for the assaulting of police officers with a gunfight, and he got an 8-year prison sentence for that. Then he was extradited back to Florida, where he went on trial for the murder of Annette Burnside. But he wouldn't really go to trial. He would end up pleading no contest to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, but he would never get out. On November 27th, 2015, Jim Burnside dies in prison. He was 78 years old. And unfortunately, this is just another story. We've heard these stories many times before, and a lot of people never seem to understand, or a lot of people don't, is that leaving these types of relationships is not easy. I have sadly covered many cases where the women end up dead because they're afraid of being killed. But they're also afraid of their children being harmed, and they're afraid of their families being harmed by this person. So in some cases, they do it because they think they're protecting the other people in their lives, which is commendable. They, unfortunately, they would rather take the beatings than be killed. And it's not easy. It's a psychological trap that these men put these women in. They have these women under their complete and utter control. And until you're ever in a situation like that, you could probably never truly understand it. But I always see people commenting well, why didn't she just leave? Why didn't she leave? Well, she did try to leave a couple of times, but I just want to reiterate, just leaving isn't easy. It's not easy whatsoever. It may sound easy to you from the outside looking in, but if you're in the situation, just based off what I've heard directly from women, it's not even close to being easy. It's terrifying. They are in their own form of prison. At least in this case, her children were left unharmed. They were raised by Annette's family. And in the end, you wish Annette didn't die. You wish police would have maybe done something before that. But in the end, Annette got the justice she very rightfully deserved. A small-town girl would vanish from a popular shopping center in Pennsylvania, and to this day, she has never been found. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Tracy Kroh. Viewer discretion is advised. 17-year-old Tracy Kroh lived in the Millersburg area of Pennsylvania. I guess is located in the Enterline Township area. Tracy had 2 sisters, and she was attending the Halifax area high school, where she was, I believe, about to enter her senior year. Tracy was considered a fantastic student. She always got good grades. She was really into art. Art was probably one of her favorite subjects. She was described by her teachers as being one of the more reliable students, one of the most hardworking students, and she had an excellent sense of humor, according to her fellow students, and even the teachers would say that. Tracy did work for the school newspaper, where she actually did the artwork for the newspaper. She was the editor of the school yearbook, so she was incredibly involved in school. She even would be spending her summer vacation working on the yearbook. Tracy, for the most part, was kind of a homebody. So, if she wasn't at home, she was probably at her sister's house. Her sister, Tammy, lived nearby in Halifax, Pennsylvania. They would hang out all the time. They spent a lot of time together. They were really close. And, Tracy would spend the night there kind of often. It was Saturday, August 5th, 1989. Tracy and her parents had borrowed Tammy's little barbecue grill. And so Tracy was going to be bringing it back to Tammy on that August 5th day. Tammy lived with her husband at the Alex Acres Trailer Park, which was just off of Pennsylvania Route 147. And that was about 7-8 miles or so away from Tracy's house. So from what people understand is that Tracy arrived at Tammy's house that day, but Tammy wasn't actually home at the time. So Tracy left the barbecue and some other item that she was returning just on the doorstep, and then she allegedly just left in her car. But Tracy never got back home that evening. Her parents, Ivan and Ellen, were not super concerned about this, however, because of how frequently Tracy would spend the night at her sister's house, that they just assumed that she decided to crash there that night. They didn't bother to call because this was just such a common occurrence. But by the next morning, Tracy hadn't arrived back home, and so they just called Tammy and said, hey, we talked to Tracy, when is she heading back home? But Tammy's like, she isn't here, and she hasn't been here. She dropped off the stuff, it looks like, but I wasn't home when it happened. I don't know where she is. So basically, her dad immediately got into his car and started driving around the area looking for Tracy, because this was unusual. His drive would take him to Millersburg Square, which is a popular shopping area there in that particular part of Pennsylvania. This is a small town as well, and so the Millersburg Square was kind of like the main hub almost. And there was a store called the Leopards Five and Dime that I guess Tracy would go to kind of frequently, or it was just like a popular store. And so when Tracy's dad got to that area, he found Tracy's car parked in front of that store. She drove a 1971 Mercury Comet. It was just kind of parked normally in a parking spot. The doors were locked. And this was literally about 4 or 5 minutes away from where her sister Tammy lived. It was definitely a hangout spot for the local teens. And so this gave her parents a little bit more reassurance because, okay, Tracy went here after Tammy's, met up with some of her friends, probably spent the night with a friend. We're good. Now, Tracy's parents were a little perturbed because usually Tracy would tell them, or call them at least, and say, hey, I'm going to be hanging out at such and such friend's house, or I'm going to be here. But she didn't do that. And so it annoyed them, but they just felt kind of that relief. However, when they reached out to some of the friends, they hadn't seen Tracy either, especially her closest friends. None of them had seen her. She had not even gone to any of their places. She hadn't been with them that particular night that she would have eventually just disappeared on. And so they reach out to police and say, okay, my daughter's missing. She's 17 years old. We found her car. Nothing seems to be out of the ordinary with her car. There's no sign of a struggle. There's no scuff marks outside of it as if she had been kidnapped or something. There was no broken windows, no blood, nothing. It just looked like she parked her car, got out of it, and then just poofed into thin air. Police asked them, has Tracy ever run away from home before? Because that's what police always think of first. They said no, she's never done that before. Tracy had so many plans. She was excited to finally get through senior year. She had plans to attend a certain college. She was really looking forward to it. She was always telling her friends and her family about her plans for the future, about what career she wanted to do. And she was hell-bent on getting there. So this idea that Tracy just suddenly picked up and said, screw all of that, and left was absurd to them. But police had to at least consider that a thought. The issue with that theory is that Tracy left literally everything behind at her house. All of her clothing, her backpack, her belongings, all of her money. She had a lot of money saved up because that's the type of person she was. She's constantly saved her money, didn't spend it that much. And all of it, literally every penny of it, was still at her house. So they got up a bunch of flyers, missing persons flyers for Tracy, and they put them all over town. The police and family would go basically business to business, especially in Millersburg, that town square center. They would ask everyone, have you seen Tracy? Did you see anything? Did you notice anything by her car at any certain time? They were getting no tips. There were no witness sightings of anything. Nothing came of all of their questioning. Tracy's dad worked for the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, and so he gave flyers out to his workers, and they were dispersing those flyers all over the city, but they got nothing. They got nothing from any of it. Usually in cases like this, you tend to get, even if the person was legitimately missing or had been killed, police would always tend to get flooded with phone calls about, I've seen her there. A bunch of uncorroborated false sightings of whatever missing person. But that didn't even happen here. I mean, people weren't even thinking they saw her anywhere. And that was just very bizarre. Not one misreported sighting of her. And that really began to freak out her parents. At that point, they believed that somebody likely took her from the Millersburg Town Square Center shopping area. But the problem with that is that even at night, if she had disappeared there at night, it was still a pretty busy area. If someone just walked up to her and accosted her, she would have screamed. There would have been some indication that some kind of struggle was happening, and that didn't happen. Nobody saw Tracy get taken from her car or get taken from the front of a store. Nobody heard a scream. Nobody heard the sounds of a fight or a struggle or anything. And someone would have heard something or seen something, which makes investigators believe, well, they're still running with the theory of, well, she still could have run away on her own, but if she was abducted, it was likely by somebody she knew, because she would have probably just gone with that person, and that person would have just made up some story for Tracy to follow them. So the parents were obviously worried that Tracy was being held prisoner somewhere, right? Maybe she was being sexually tortured, or just tortured in general. She was not being fed, and were they going to be waiting for some kind of ransom note or a ransom call? It's not exactly like this family is this well-known rich family or anything. They weren't going to be able to get much money out of them, but so Tracy's mom sat by the phone the entire time. She never left, while Tracy's dad and the family and the police and volunteers were out there just combing the entire area for miles and miles looking for her. But again, it was just nothing but nothingness. And I have to reiterate how unusual that is. Like I said, again, not even a false sighting of her. No clothing items, nothing. After a year or so goes by, she still hasn't been found, no trace of her. They're getting no tips, they're getting nothing. Even after there's about a $6,000 reward put out there, no one's biting. The Millersburg police were at a loss. They said, listen, we gotta be honest, we have no idea where she is. We have no idea what happened to her, because we've gotten such little information from anyone that we can't even piece together realistically what happened to her. They did state that we have no evidence of foul play. However, that doesn't mean foul play isn't involved. It's just that whoever did this was careful about it. They were good about it. Again, she was probably lured away by someone she knew and she trusted. Foul play doesn't mean that there's a broken window and there's blood everywhere. Foul play could mean there's no evidence whatsoever. But because there was no evidence, they still had to have in the back of their mind, maybe she's out there on her own accord. By 1990, they raised enough money to get some big signs made, and they've got billboards up. They have more flyers distributing out there. They've got Tracy's image just big and bold on these billboards. And if you've seen anything, if you've heard anything, please call. You can report your information anonymously. We just need Tracy home. But it really led to nothing again. In March of 1990, they did finally get some tips that police should search a nearby pond in Halifax, because this tipster heard Tracy was probably in there. So they brought in about 12, 13 or so professional divers who specifically do this kind of thing for search and rescue. They spent approximately 48 hours worth of time searching this large pond. They searched it top to bottom, side to side. They, scooped up dirt from the bottom of this with their hands and searched and looked, and nothing. No body, no clothing, no purse or wallet or anything like that. Tracy's 18th birthday came and went in April, and the family who wanted to be celebrating her 18th birthday are now just at a loss for where Tracy even is. June of 1990 came. The Halifax area high school was having their graduation, and they were missing one student. And that weighed heavily not only on her family, but it weighed heavily on all of her friends and her classmates, her teachers. It just weighed on everyone. Tracy's parents would come out and say that, listen, we know somebody out there knows something. We're looking into this camera right now, right, on the news, and we're telling you know something, to whoever that may be. Because a 17-year-old girl doesn't just poof into thin air and vanish from a popular shopping center and nobody knows a thing about it. That's insane. Somebody knows something. After another year or so goes by, police are now essentially stating that we no longer have this belief that Tracy vanished on her own accord. No shit. They basically are now saying, this is more than likely a genuine missing person, probably met with foul play. And they just kept going back to this idea that it had to be someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone she cared for, maybe someone she was friends with, maybe family friends. She didn't just get taken by someone. She was tricked. Police had interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of people. They interviewed as many classmates as they could. They interviewed teachers. They interviewed people she had maybe worked with, other family members. September of 1992, police get what they think is a substantial piece of information, a substantial tip from a jailhouse informant. And we all know how reliable those can be. This jailhouse informant was apparently in prison with a man named Larry Ramp, or Rampy. This Larry person had admitted to this informant that he was the one to kidnap and kill Tracy Kroh. And Larry Ramp told this informant that he then buried Tracy in Roanoke, Virginia. Police investigate this particular inmate, Larry Ramp. They dig into his whereabouts. They look into where he was during the time that Tracy was taken. And they came to the conclusion that he was not even close to being in the area, that there was no way realistically he could have done this. And most importantly, he had no idea who Tracy Kroh was beforehand. Nobody in Tracy's life knew who this man was. This informant also said Larry Ramp told the informant that he had kept Tracy's class ring and as a souvenir, but police searched the home where this Larry Ramp was living, top to bottom. They found nothing, and that's where he said it was supposed to be. They came to the conclusion that this guy was just a bunch of bullshit. On November 30th, 1993, they finally found some evidence. A farmer in Washington Township, Pennsylvania, I guess he was near the, I'm going to say this wrong, I'm sure, the Wiconisco Creek in Pennsylvania, where he found Tracy Kroh's driver's license and her National Honor Society card. It wasn't with a wallet, they were just two separate pieces that were found washed up onto this nearby farmland. The items were clearly very damaged, especially water damaged, and so they knew they had been in the water for a very long time. So in April of 1994, they do a very thorough search along the Wiconisco. They search the actual creek itself. They search the land surrounding it. They do say that they find some more tiny pieces of her belongings, but they have not specified what those belongings actually are. They did bring in scent dogs and cadaver dogs to pick up any trace they can, but they didn't come up with anything. They found, like I said, a couple items, but they didn't find Tracy or anything like that. There was another tip that came in 1994 that basically stated that Tracy was kidnapped along with two other recently reported missing women, Beth Miller and Tiffany Sessions, and that they had all been abducted and taken to Texas and turned into sex workers. It's not completely out of the ordinary. These types of things have happened before, but investigators really dug into this. They looked into it. They went to Texas. They interviewed all the people involved, and it was all just a bunch of bullshit. And then we fast forward all the way to August of 2019, when a man named Matthew Webster comes into the picture. According to a woman named Holly Mallett, who I guess was acquaintances with this Matthew Webster person, she said that Matthew Webster had confessed to the murder of Tracy Kroh. Matthew had apparently said, quote, "It was supposed to be just a rape and done, but then it turned out to be a lot more than that." When police approached Matthew, he said, "I don't even know who this Molly or Holly Mallett person is." He said he had never talked to her prior to any of this, but then police found out that was a lie. Police had wiretapped them and discovered that the two of them did know each other, but ultimately they came to the conclusion that for whatever fucked up reason, Holly was lying about this, or Matthew was leading her on and he was lying about it, but he had no connection to it. They had searched his house, they searched his property, they searched everywhere that was connected to him. They dug up areas, they brought in cadaver dogs, they looked and they found nothing. Once again, nothing, and determined that this guy probably wasn't involved in Tracy's disappearance and likely murder. The most recent update was in 2022 when they had arrested an 89-year-old man named Mark Warfel. Mark Warfel or Warfel was acquaintances with the Kroh family. So in 2022, the 89-year-old man is under arrest, but not with connection to Tracy Kroh. He was under arrest for robbery charges, burglary stuff. He had also been suspected in killing his wife, Doris. From what I understand, Mark Warfel may be the father to one of Tracy's sisters, and so that's kind of how they were connected. Mark owned this house at one point that was turned into an auto body shop that he would repair cars at. And apparently Tracy and Tracy's dad were always over there helping him out. And Tracy and her dad had helped build the garage portion where the cars would be held. And so I don't know how they came to this conclusion or how they came to him, but they believed that he had something to do with Tracy's case. Well, shortly after he was arrested in 2022, he was then put in the hospital because he was having some medical emergencies. One of Tracy's sisters would go to the hospital room, and unbeknownst to him, she was wearing like a recording device. He denied having anything to do with Tracy's kidnapping and possible murder. He tells the sister, "Police think I had something to do with it, and I think they're going to maybe charge me with this." Then he tells her, "I didn't do it, but I do know who did." He describes a person only as the name a big goofus, not an actual name. He says this big goofus person, whoever it may be, was responsible for killing Tracy, and that he knows what happened to her. Warfel told the sister on this recording, then this big goofus person dumped Tracy's body in a mine shaft. When police heard this recording, they thought this was all very strange. You're saying you didn't do it, but you've known this entire time who did it? It seemed very unusual. It seemed like someone who was now trying to put himself in the investigation in order to take heat off of him, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. All it does is it makes him look more guilty. So police got a warrant to search that house that Warfel lived on and the auto body property that was a part of the house. And they would take out a bunch of concrete from the ground, and they did the little sonar things to detect if there's things underground. They dug up everything. They did what they called as a controlled demolition of the entire property, and they found nothing. Nothing at all. They didn't find any human remains because they believed she was there. They didn't find any clothing items, nothing. Warfel was confident. He said, "They can dig all they want. They're not going to find anything here because I didn't do this." But why are you withholding who this person is that you think did it? He's actually saying he solved the case. He's saying, well, I figured it out. I know who did it. Well, who is it then? He's not saying the person's name. Or if he is, he's telling it to police and police haven't announced the name, or they've looked into whoever this person is and they've come up with nothing. But the point of the matter is we're in 2023 now. The most recent update was back in late 2022, and that's it. Tracy has still not been found. Only thing of hers that has been found is her driver's license and a couple tiny pieces of her belongings. Her body's never been found. Clothing has never been found. They haven't found anything unusual on her car like fingerprints or DNA from another person. They have gotten very, very few tips over this entire time span. The most recent information coming in the most recent years, but all of that appears to have just panned out to a whole bunch of nada. This Mark Warfel person, though, I think they're probably on the verge of something here because he had a connection to the family, a very strong connection. He knew them. He is someone that Tracy knew well and trusted. He is someone that Tracy would have probably gone with had he asked her to if he met her at that shopping center. So that explains why she would go, why no one saw or heard anything crazy happening. Nobody can, from my understanding, I don't know, maybe they've looked into this and they've determined one or the other, but to my understanding, no one can place Mark Warfel in that shopping center at the same time that Tracy would have disappeared. But it does make sense that she would have gone with him without a sound, without a peep. And why is he now saying he knows who did it? To me, it sounds like he is genuinely trying to take attention away from his involvement. I could be wrong, but it seems very fishy. However, Mark Warfel was finally released from police custody and never really went to trial for his burglary-related charges because he was not competent to stand trial. And I don't know if that's also hindering them from prosecuting him in the Tracy Kroh case. I'm not sure. But at this point, there is no resolution. There is no body. There is no answers. There is nothing. In August of 1989, 17-year-old Tracy Kroh vanished off the face of the earth. There has been not one single sighting of her, even a false sighting of her, ever since. Something clearly happened to her that day. She went with someone, likely, that she knew and trusted. That person took advantage of that trust and probably did some bad things to her and then killed her. And God knows where she is now. Someone somewhere out there knows the truth, and perhaps that someone is you. If you have any information about the disappearance and possible murder of 17-year-old Tracy Kroh, please contact the Pennsylvania State Police at 717-362-8700. The family of Tracy Kroh deserves to get her back. They deserve to put her to rest, and her family and her should get the justice they all rightfully deserve. Tis the season to have the scared out of you. Anyway, hello true crimerers. I figured it's October. It's spooky season. Halloween's around the corner. So I thought I would cover or talk about 5 true crime cases that scare me. So this video is 5 of the scariest true crime cases that scares Mike. Viewer discretion is advised. Number 15. I'm kidding. Oh my God, could you imagine? I'm not going to do that to you guys. But number 5. The Robeson family murders. It was July 22nd, 1968, in the little community of Goodhart, Michigan. One cabin resident would tell the caretaker of the area there was a really horrific odor coming from one of the nearby cabins. Chauncey Bliss, who was the caretaker, would go out to check on this smell. So he goes out to the cabin in question, knocks on the door, nobody answers. The last time he knew, the Robeson family was staying in that cabin at that time. Now, no one had seen the Robesons for a few weeks. They had been there since the end of June or so, but they did tell people that they were going to be traveling down to Florida and some other place to purchase some property. So it wasn't completely confusing or suspicious that they were not answering the door. But when the caretaker approached the house, it was very evident something really horrific smell coming from that house. The doors of the cabin were locked. He didn't have the set of keys on him, and so thinking something was wrong, he took an instrument and he pried open the door. And when he did, he came across a scene from a horror movie. 6 bodies inside that house, all in a state of decay. There was congealed and dried blood all over the floor, blood spatter all over the walls. And he recognized the first body he saw was Shirley Robeson, the matriarch of the family. So the caretaker runs out of the house and he immediately goes to get to a phone to call the police. The police arrive. The bodies are found in a couple different locations. There's 3 bodies piled up sort of in a hallway or entryway. And there's one body kind of between a bedroom and the hallway, and then one in the bedroom directly. 42-year-old Richard Robeson and his 7-year-old daughter, her name was Susan, both of them had been shot to death, but it was also evident that they had both been bludgeoned over the head several times with a hammer, and I believe the hammer was found at the scene. Other 4 bodies, including 40-year-old Shirley, 19-year-old Richie, 16-year-old Gary, and 12-year-old Randy, they had all been shot to death. And they had been shot based on ammunition that they found at the scene that had been shot with a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. There was no forced entry in the house, no broken windows, no kicked in doors, nothing of that nature. So they think that either the killer was let in the house by someone in this family, maybe someone they knew, or the killer was able to enter the house through an unlocked door. They really couldn't confirm if the family kept the doors locked or unlocked at all times. There really wasn't much forensic evidence left behind that would help police. I mean, this is in 1968. This is before modern technology really existed, where we could get skin cell DNA from things and all that. And so when they don't know about these things, a lot of times they don't collect evidence back then the proper way that we would now. But they did have like the shell casings. They dusted the cabin for fingerprints, for everything like that, but they really didn't come up with anything from that. Police from the get-go really believed that Richard Robeson was probably the primary target of this. Richard was the breadwinner of the family. He was a successful executive. He owned his own business, made a lot of money. But then it really kind of made them wonder, like, okay, if they're going to kill Richard, why kill everybody else? But again, they might have been witnesses. But as they look further into Richard's business dealings, they realize that he was not doing as well as he may have claimed he was. His business, his company, was beginning to get in trouble. Like, they were losing money. While the family was going to be in Goodhart on this vacation at this cabin, he left the business in the hands of one of his employees, a 30-year-old named Joseph Scalaro III. And then what police would find out after this investigation got started was that Joseph Scalaro had been embezzling money from this company. They don't really know if Richard truly knew that or not, but they did find phone records that Joseph and Richard had a conversation on June 25th, 1968, and that call would go to that cabin where the family was found, because they had been there starting at like the late June, and they do know that the family was there on June 25th because Richard had interacted with the caretaker on June 25th. But a phone call came in. They determined it came from Joseph. And so what police theorize is that Richard may have found out about the embezzling while he was on vacation. And maybe he confronted Joseph over the phone and said, hey, listen, I'm going to the police about this when I get back. Perhaps. And so maybe that prompted Joseph to go, well, guess I'm going to go out there and kill him and his family. It's a possibility. When they looked into Joseph's alibi, they found out that his family, his friends, for a good 12-hour portion of that day on June 25th, nobody knew where Joseph was. And another thing they found was that so Joseph would go to the shooting range, and apparently in one of the areas he was shooting, police collected the shell casings from that, and it matched shell casings found at the murder scene. It's circumstantial because it was just shell casings. It wasn't, they couldn't like do the whole line up under a microscope thing, and like match up the little grooves. So it was inconclusive for the most part. But there were no witnesses who could place Joseph Scalaro in Goodhart at the time of the murder. There were no witnesses who saw or heard anything when the murders would have happened. There was no actual genuine evidence linking Joseph to this murder. They had circumstantial evidence at best. They had a possible motive, but it doesn't mean he actually did it. So Emmett County, which is where murders took place, the prosecutor said, I don't have enough evidence to go forward with an indictment or to charge Joseph Scalaro with anything. But then the Oakland County prosecutor, which is where the family was from, they said, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot. These people lived in my area. Let's try it. And it worked. He was able to press charges against Joseph Scalaro. But before they could arrest him, Joseph must have caught wind of it, because as they got to his home to arrest him, he was dead. He had shot himself in the head. He left behind a suicide note that read, I am a liar, a cheat, a phony, but I am not a killer. I am scared and sick. Implying in his note that he wasn't the one responsible for the murders. But why did he kill himself if he knew police were about to arrest him? Did he maybe think, well, there's going to be no hope, I have no chance of getting away with this, even though I didn't do it? Maybe. Maybe he didn't want to deal with being falsely imprisoned or falsely accused, and he killed himself. Or maybe he did do it, and he just killed himself because of that. But to this very day, the murders of the Robison family remains unsolved. Number 4, the disappearance of Angela Hammond. Angela Hammond was a 20-year-old young woman living in Clinton, Missouri. Angela was very popular. She was friendly. Everybody loved her. Very charming personality. She was attending Central Missouri State University, and she was engaged to a man named Rob Schaefer. They had from what it sounds like, a really good relationship. It was April 4th, 1991 at approximately 10 p.m. Angela had dropped her fiancé Rob off at his house because they had just gone to a barbecue, and then Rob had to go back to the house to babysit his brother because his mom was working like a late night shift, I guess. And then at 11:15 p.m., Rob, who is now at home, his mom had just gotten home, and he gets a phone call from Angela, and she is at a payphone. This is at the intersection of Jefferson and 2nd Street. While she was on the phone with Rob, and this is where the creepy aspect comes in, she says she's telling him on the phone, some creepy guy just pulled up in this green pickup truck right next to me in the phone booth. It was eerie because it's a dark parking lot. There's no one else there. She didn't really know why this guy had to pull up and park right next to the phone booth. The man gets out of the truck. He kind of walks around his truck, and Angela's just describing him to Rob over the phone, describing his truck to him. And then the guy gets back into his truck for like a minute, and then he gets out of the truck, according to Angela. He now has a flashlight, and he's looking around his truck. And he kind of seems to be lingering around the phone, and Rob can hear Angela ask the man, do you need to use the phone? He says no, and then Angela and Rob can continue on with their conversation. And then all of a sudden, Rob hears Angela scream. A chilling, terrifying scream. And then Rob hears a man say, quote, I didn't need to use the phone anyway. Now, Rob knew where she was, and so he immediately drops his phone, gets into his vehicle, and he books it to that phone booth area. But as he is driving, he sees a green pickup truck driving super fast the opposite direction from the area of the payphone. He then hears these blood-curdling screams of a woman screaming for Rob's name. And so Rob sees this, and then he spins around, he flips a bitch, right? And he begins to chase after the truck. When he did this, apparently, he blew out the transmission, because I guess of how, I'm not really sure how that works, but the transmission blew out, and his car ended up stalling, and the guy in the truck with Angela got away. According to Angela's description, this was a green pickup truck, and it had this decal on the back window. It was like a fish jumping out of water type thing. And she described the man to Rob, who then Rob tells police the description, and they come up with this particular composite drawing of him. It's not exactly the greatest, but it's, he's relaying information that he heard from somebody else. There weren't really any other witnesses who can corroborate Rob's account of this truck speeding and him flipping around and her screaming. No one else really could say they heard or saw that. So they give Rob a polygraph test, and he passes it with flying colors. But then other witnesses would come forward to state that sometime just before Angela got into that parking lot, there were a couple of witnesses who did see a green pickup truck and a disheveled looking man coming out of that truck who was sort of lingering around those payphones. But then apparently he came back when Angela was there. Within a week of Angela's disappearance, Rob was completely cleared. They were able to find out that he had nothing to do with this. And then Angela's case goes cold. There's really no leads or tips. And it's so scary because she was on the phone conversating with her fiance and literally describing her eventual kidnapper and probable killer. And he heard her screaming and he heard his voice saying, I didn't need to use the phone anyway. Then he saw the truck speeding away with his fiance in it, and there was nothing he could do. In 2021 or so, police in Clinton would announce that there was a kind of a lead. Some informant had received a magazine cutout letter, and this letter read, "Hello, no. We know who you are, no. People like you deserve what you get, and we know where your foxy daughter is. She will see us soon. Tell wife's name she has our deepest sympathy in her further loss. Goodbye." The letter, I guess, correctly identified the informant's court-issued number along with his estranged wife's first name. The letter was postmarked April 4th, 1991, the day of Angela's abduction. The informant's wife and daughter, who were also named Angela, were living in Clinton at the time. Police, like a year or so later, end up getting a phone call from an anonymous caller stating information about that cutout, magazine cutout letter. But whoever authored that letter, whoever put it together, they knew this informant because they knew the informant's wife. But why they were tying it in with this Angela Hammond thing, I'm not sure. They don't really even know for sure if the letter had anything to do with Angela Hammond's disappearance or if it was just some sort of stupid joke or hoax. Anonymous caller, they were never able to trace that number, and that person never called back. And to this day, the disappearance of Angela Hammond remains unsolved. Number 3, the Blind River murders. I watched this case on Unsolved Mysteries when I was younger, and this case, for whatever reason, was the one to scare me more than any other murder case ever talked about on that show. I don't know why. It's just so terrifying to me. It was June of 1991. 62-year-old Gordon McAllister and his 59-year-old wife Jacqueline, they were on a trip. They were originally from Lindsay, Ontario in Canada, and their trip was to take their RV and go across Canada. They had been married for about 39 years. It was during the first leg of their trip. They had been driving for some time, and they decided we need to finally pull off the road and get some sleep. It was the middle of the night on June 28th, 1991. They pulled into the Blind River rest stop. There was nobody else in the parking area. That was not a single soul in sight. So they parked their RV, locked their door, and they lay down for bed. At approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, they hear a knock on the camper door. And that's, I think, one of the things that scares. It's just like you're sleeping in a rest stop in your RV, and you hear a rap at your door from no one knows you're there, and so it's just so creepy. And so Jacqueline, she wakes up and she opens the door, and immediately she is bum rushed back inside the RV by this man with like this long blonde hair, looks like a wig, and he's armed with 2 guns. At that point, Gordon wakes up and he begins to like, hey, you need to get out of here, Guy's like, I'm gonna rob you. I'm here, give me all your jewelry, all your money. And Jackie is like, okay, we're going to comply. He points the guns at them and says, first, I'm going to rob you, and then I am going to kill you. They get all of their valuables together. They hand it over to the man. And they're begging to him, we're not going to tell anyone about this. We swear. We won't say a thing. We'll just leave. Jackie is now pleading for her life, and he just lifts the gun as she's begging for her life and shoots her directly in her chest, killing her instantly. Gordon tries to run, but then the guy lifts the gun and shoots towards him. He shoots Gordon, I guess somewhere in his back, and Gordon's able to escape out the door of the RV, and then he rolls under the RV before the assailant was able to get out. As this assailant is now walking out of the RV, someone begins to drive and pull into the rest stop. This man would turn out to be 29-year-old Brian Donald Major. Brian Major saw this man carrying 2 guns, and because he's getting out of his car when he notices this, and the assailant approaches him and says, "Is there a problem?" And then like, "No, there's no problem, not at all." Like, hastily, kind of like he sees what's happening here, and like he tries to get back into his car. But all of a sudden, the assailant goes in front of Brian's car, and as Brian's trying to start his car to take off, the guy, shoots Brian right through the windshield and kills him. Meanwhile, Gordon, who's been shot, is lying underneath the RV, hoping the assailant doesn't notice. And luckily, he doesn't. And so the assailant gets into a van and speeds off. Witnesses would later tell police that they did, in fact, see like this big blue van kind of driving through multiple lanes, like super fast speeds. About a week or so after the murders happened, police would release a pretty terrifying composite image. This was a computer-generated image that they were using their, I guess, newfounded computer technology to do this. And this is one of the most realistic, human-looking composites I've ever seen. But at the same time, it is horrifying. The image of this man, who is the supposed killer, is just... It gave me nightmares when I was a kid. Gordon was at one point, talked about and looked at as a possible suspect, but they were to rule him out. I mean, he was shot in the back. They know he didn't do this. In June of 1995, a man named Ronald Glenn West was listed as a possible suspect in this case. Ronald was a former police officer. The thing is that when this assailant knocked on the RV door, he identified himself as a police officer, which, at that time, it turns out he wasn't. Well, in 1995, he had been charged with multiple different armed robberies, and he was sentenced to about 10 years in prison for those. In 1999, he was then charged with 2 murders, and these are murders dating back to the 1970s. And the reason why he came up on the radar for the Blind River murders is because his ex-wife would say that, one, he owned a big blue van, like was seen speeding away from the crime scene. He owned a .22 caliber rifle, which is what one of the weapons was used in the case, in the murder. And then the other thing is that he actually owned a blonde wig, that's kind of like a whoa moment, because the guy who did this, according to Gordon, it very much looked like the guy was wearing a blonde wig. It did not look like his actual hair. Ronald Glenn West was convicted of the 2 murders from the 70s and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 2012, Gordon passes away. Ronald West has never been charged or indicted with the Blind River murders. They don't have the physical evidence to say for sure that he is their guy. It sounds like him, former police officer, posed as a police officer. He had the wig, he had the gun, same type of van. You think it all kind of clicks, but, you do still need the evidence. And so, unfortunately, the Blind River murders case has remained unsolved. Number 2, Elisa Lam. I know a lot of you are very familiar with the Elisa Lam case, and if you have seen the Netflix documentary about her case, you pretty much know or have an idea of what the actual solution in this case ended up being. But there is still a lot of people out there who very much doubt what the Netflix docuseries said. Elisa Lam was a student at the University of British Columbia, and in 2013, she was taking a trip through California. Elisa traveled alone. She was by herself. She had gone to San Diego. She went to the San Diego Zoo. She then arrived in Los Angeles on January 26th. She checked into the Cecil Hotel about 2 days after she arrived in Los Angeles. And Elisa was given a shared room with like other college-aged girls. But apparently the roommates there started to complain about Elisa having this very strange and erratic, odd behavior. Elisa was diagnosed as bipolar, and there are some reports that say that Elisa sometimes did not take her bipolar medication. And the roommates would state that Elisa was leaving them notes that said, like, go away, go home, get out of here. And she was just being very bizarre. She would then go to a live taping of the Conan show, and I guess she was escorted off of the set because of erratic behavior. With the situation with the roommates, the hotel basically put Elisa in her own room. On January 31st, 2013, she was supposed to check out that day. And she was supposed to call her parents on that day when she was checking out of the hotel, but she never did. And so after a brief time, they would contact the Los Angeles Police Department to report her missing because they had never heard from her again. So once they found out that she was at the Cecil Hotel, they did a thorough search, they said, of the hotel. They went room to room. There was only so much they could legally do in terms of searching. They couldn't just go into every person's room without permission. On February 13th, police would release the now very famous elevator footage. So what you're about to see is a segment kind of edited, just for time, of the elevator footage that was captured. So for about 2.5, 3 minutes or so, Elisa is seen with some very strange behavior in this elevator. She kind of pops in, and then she begins to press like every button, and then at one point she like hides against a wall as if she's hiding from someone. Then at one point kind of hops out like she's playing hide and go seek or trying to scare someone, right? So then gets back in. And then at one point, in one of the more unsettling parts, she is outside the elevator and it looks like she's talking to someone. You don't ever see any other person, not once. You don't see anyone other than her ever. But then she's doing these weird like hand movements, right? Like it's just so bizarre. It's so unsettling. But then she kind of walks off of frame and that's it. You never see her again. It was February 19th when the hotel became aware of some disturbing information. The faucets were beginning to put out really dark, kind of brownish water, very disgusting looking water. And they have a maintenance guy go up to the roof to check on the big water tanks they have up on the roof. And once he looks in one of these tanks, he sees Elisa Lam. She's lying nude, face up in the water. Her clothing is also in there. And it was the same clothes that she had been wearing in that elevator footage. And that means that the water that was running through the hotel was water with her decayed body in it. The autopsy would show no signs of any physical trauma. So no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no, blunt force trauma, nothing. There was no indication that she did anything to herself in terms of suicide. No ligature marks, no cuts on her wrists or anywhere. She had a very small amount of alcohol, like below the legal limit in her system. There were no recreational drugs in her system, and there was a small amount of her prescription drugs in her system. but it was not even at the levels that she was prescribed to take, so she was under medicating. Ultimately, her cause of death was labeled as accidental drowning. The big mystery was, how did Elisa get into that tank? How did she even get onto the roof? Because apparently you needed roof access. You needed a key card or keys to get up there. And only staff has access to those ways of getting onto the roof. So at one point they're like, well, did someone in the staff do something to her? Is that who she was talking to in that elevator footage? They also found out that the hotel's fire escapes could actually basically get someone to the roof of the building and bypass all of the security measures to get up there. It was possible. When this story initially came out, the story that we were told was that when the body was found, the lid was closed. The whole thing was closed, which is what made it such a big mystery, was that there would have been no way that Elisa would have been able to close the lid back on herself because where she was at in terms of the water level in the tank, there would have been no way she could have physically put it back down. That's what we believed, right? But the actual truth is that when the maintenance man went up there, the tank lid was open already. And that's about it. I mean, it's just now been ruled accidental drowning. But it really, the question still remains as to why, how did she get up to that roof? Did she use the fire escape? There's no video of that. No one saw her doing it. How did she know to climb this ladder to get to the lid of this tank? And how did she open it? How did she climb into it? And she got all her clothes off, in there. How did she drown? She knew how to swim. So it's like, how did she drown in that water? Maybe after some time, she got tired of waiting and she drowned. I'm not sure. There were no illicit drugs in her system. She had a very small amount of alcohol, not enough that would say like, oh my, okay, she was like shit-faced drunk. She wasn't. Her own prescription medications were less than what she should have been taking. So it's not like she was inebriated that caused this to happen. It's strange. The circumstances of how and why Elisa Lam got into that tank is still a mystery. Well, all they really know is that she got into that tank somehow. And it doesn't really answer the question of, did somebody put her in that tank? It's possible, but she died of drowning. So did they force her under the water somehow? How would they have done that? But also, if she was in there just by herself, how did she drown? It's strange. It's unsettling, it's creepy. But really, it's an elevator footage that was taken probably moments before her death that just really makes this case so scary. Because you either see a woman who's communicating with someone off camera, that's someone who's never come forward, or she's talking to a ghost, right? Some people think she's talking because the Cecil Hotel is a pretty shady place with a history. Some people say like, oh, maybe she was seeing ghosts, right? Or you're looking at a woman who was under-medicating herself for bipolar disorder, who was going through a rough patch, who may have been mentally unstable at that time and was maybe hallucinating, maybe something. She was unwell, and you see that in full effect on camera. And then she ends up in a tank, dead. How she got there, though, is a mystery. Why she was in there, a mystery. And while how she died has been solved, really why she died and the circumstances behind her death still very much remain unsolved. Number 1, the Keddie cabin murders. It was April 11th, 1981, in the area of Keddie, California. Sue Sharp and her 5 children had recently moved down to this area after she had separated from her husband in 1979. They moved to the Northern California area because that's where Sue's brother lived. She and the kids were originally from Connecticut. And they were staying in cabin number 28. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning on April 12th, 1981, Sue's daughter Sheila arrives back at cabin number 28. And when she enters the cabin, she sees a nightmare. She finds the body of her mother Sue, her brother John, and John's friend Dana. Her sister Tina, who was supposed to be in the cabin, was missing. The 3 youngest kids who were in the cabin that night, Rick, Greg, and Justin, were in their bedroom asleep, but alive. They were left unharmed. Sue, John, and Dana had been brutally murdered. They were bludgeoned to death with hammers. They had all been bound with medical tape and electrical cords. There were 2 bloody knives found at the scene, hammers, and they were covered in blood. The knives were like, one of them was bent. It was used so forcefully that the knife bent. Sheila, one of the daughters, had been staying at a nearby cabin with some friends and was close by to where, she had lived. But nobody heard any screams that night. Nobody heard altercations. Nobody heard a thing. But then there was a couple who cabin number 16 that said sometime around 1:15 a.m. they think they heard the sound of some muffled screams coming from somewhere. Could that have been the murders? It's possible, but they don't really know for sure. There was no forced entry in the cabin. There was also, according to police, no known motive. Nothing was stolen. Sue wasn't sexually assaulted. It was an incredibly bloody scene. There was just blood everywhere. It was such a violent attack. One of the most confusing aspects of this case is the fact that 3 young children left alive inside the cabin. And the 3 kids, it seems like they slept through this entire thing. So Justin, who was one of the boys, was actually a friend of Ricky and Greg, but he was sleeping over that night. While Ricky and Greg don't claim they saw anything, Justin Smart says he thought he saw Sue with 2 men, and they both wore glasses, and they would end up coming up with these composite drawings of those 2 men based on his description. He said one of the men had a hammer in his hand. Justin says that he thinks John and Dana came into the cabin that night and got into an argument with these 2 unknown men, and then a violent fight happened from it. And then apparently Tina, one of the youngest daughters, was just kidnapped and taken out of the cabin because Tina wasn't found in the cabin. She was supposed to be there, but she wasn't there. In terms of suspects, the police really said they had 2 viable suspects. One of them was Justin Smart's dad, and his name was Martin Smart. And then Martin Smart's friend and house guest named John Bobady. These were 2 men who had connections with organized crime. And it was actually organized crime that investigated these murders and not homicide, which was also very strange. Both men had been seen in a bar the night of the murder acting very, very strange. Martin Smart would tell police that he owned a hammer that suddenly somehow went missing from his garage. But not much really came from that investigation into these 2 suspects, at least not at that time. 3 years after the triple murder, it now became a quadruple homicide. A human skull had been found about 30 miles away from where the murders happened. This human skull would later be identified as Tina Sharp. The case from the get-go was considered to be horribly investigated. It was a botched investigation. It almost felt like the police were deliberately not trying to solve it. Like when they would reopen this case around 2013 or so as a cold case unit with brand new people on the case, they found evidence that clearly had never been looked at or touched by the initial investigators. And they found out in this cold case unit that Marty Smart's wife had actually left Marty the day of the bodies being found. And then later, she got a handwritten note from Marty, and the note read, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want?" Now, this letter was given to police shortly after the murders happened. However, it was never looked at as a confession. It was never treated as a confession. It was never really looked at as evidence at all. And in 2008, when Marilyn, who was Marty's wife at the time, was interviewed, she said she fully believes that her husband and his friend Bo were responsible for this quadruple homicide. But then the sheriff, or the detective, whatever, who was initially investigating the Keddie cabin murders, said that he refuted this because he said, well, they both passed polygraph tests back in the initial part of this investigation, so they were cleared. Because we all know polygraph tests are completely accurate, right? Well, it turns out that Marty was actually buds with the investigating detective. They were close. One of the cold case detectives in 2016 met with a counselor who wanted to remain anonymous. I guess this was a counselor to Martin Smart, who back in May of 1981 allegedly Marty confessed to this counselor in 1981 about the murders. So this counselor told case detective that Marty said, quote, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." The counselor tried to tell the Department of Justice about this confession back in 1981. They said, sorry, we're not doing anything with that. And they dismissed it as being hearsay. In 2016, a very rusted hammer was found at the bottom of a lake, and it's believed that this was one of the murder weapons. They did find a couple of the murder weapons at the house, but many instruments were used, hammers and knives. And so they believe that this other hammer they found would have been really close to where cabin 28 was. It had since been demolished, cabin 28, but they believe that hammer was a part of the crime. One of the biggest theories is that there was some kind of love triangle, that Marty and Sue were having some kind of affair. There was also a rumor that Sue Sharp had been trying to tell Marilyn, Marty's wife at the time, had been trying to convince her to leave Marty, and Marty supposedly found out that Sue was doing that, and Marty flipped his shit. And so he enlisted the help of Bo, his good buddy, to help carry out these murders. And that the plan was to only kill Sue, but what they didn't account for was that there were going to be other people in the cabin that night. And so whoever was there who physically would witness these people coming into the house had to be killed too. All because, allegedly, Sue was trying to tell Marilyn to leave her husband. Even though in this theory, Marty and Sue are having an affair. It's bizarre. But it does explain why the three boys were left unharmed, because one of the boys in that bedroom was Marty Smart's own child. It also does kind of make sense as to why Marilyn would end up leaving her husband the day the bodies were found. And it does explain the context of that note, like, look what you've made me do, I've killed 4 people. The cold case team would kind of unearth some, like, possibilities that Bo and Marty were involved in some kind of drug smuggling scheme, the Department of Justice was involved, and that the sheriff was on the take, and all of this stuff, like the police were deliberately covering up this crime because Marty and Bo were drug dealers connected to crime syndicates, and they were looped in with the police. It's very possible that that's actually what the case was. And it does explain why they sent organized crime people to investigate this murder, not homicide. They knew from the get-go who was responsible, and they needed to cover it up. But the new cold case team is still very much actively working on this case. However, if Marty Smart and Bo Bobedy are responsible for the murders, they got away with it. Both of them have since died. They are really the only 2 actual suspects in this case. All they know is that at least one person, more than likely 2, entered the cabin 28 that night and brutally murdered 4 people. Well, murdered 3 people, and then for some reason kidnapped the young girl and killed her at a different time and location. And that's one of the things that people don't seem to understand why that occurred. Why wasn't she just killed in the cabin that night? Why was she taken? Was there a second kind of like, oh, okay, I'm going to take this little girl since she's here, and we're going to have our way with her, and then we'll kill her? That's possible. And while if those 2 are the killers, they will never face justice, there is still a chance that they could get some of the people who were involved in the cover-up. If they can get proof of it, they can make it happen. They can arrest the appropriate people. Because if it was those 2 men, they should have been arrested, charged, and convicted of this murder, or at least gone to a trial. And the fact that nobody else was looked at, it kind of signifies that these 2 men must have been responsible for it, but they don't really know that 100% for sure. And they never really will, unless they have some kind of confession from the players involved. It is also possible that a completely different person entered the cabin that night and did this horrible crime. But here we are in 2024, and the Keddie cabin murders still officially remain unsolved. So those are 5 true crime cases that I've always found creepy. I think it's a lot to do with like people entering a home in the middle of the night kind of thing, but I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Have you heard about these cases? Do you think they're scary? Do they creep you out? But yeah. Anyway, that's it for today's video. So we'll see you for whenever I put up the next one. Until then, ta-ta for now. True crime arunish.